All right, welcome back to the Tim Teaches podcast. I'm your host, Tim McCoy. Today I have the pleasure of welcoming Ronika Merl. Ronika, your story is wide-ranging. You're a survivor of sexual violence, human trafficking, and domestic violence. You were able to escape that world, and now you're an advocate helping other women who have been through similar situations. On top of that, you're also a screenwriter, author, and poet. Thank you so much for joining me. I can't wait to dive into your story and hear more
Thank you
about you.
so much. Thank you so much for having me on. Yeah, it sounds like quite the journey when you summarize it all in one sentence. That seems quite wild. But yeah, thank you so much for having me on.
I kind of like to start from the beginning, if you wouldn't mind. You're not, from what I understand, you're not originally from Ireland or.
No, I came here. I came here quite late. I came here when I was 20. But yeah, let's start at the beginning. I was born into a quite indigenous, very secluded mountain tribe in India, where your livelihood was goat herding and there was barely any electricity. There was no running water. We lived in clay huts.
Oh.
It was quite 15th century, really. So to go from, I lived there until I was 7. And then I moved, my mother's Austrian and my dad's Indian. And then I moved with my mom to Austria, where the lifestyle was quite different. So we had like a nice big house and a vineyard to go to in the summer. And,
Oh, beautiful.
yeah, it was nice. Summering on the vineyard. It's quite nice.
Yes.
But then I fell in with quite a bad crowd and I was in prostitution for 4 years. During that time, I was trafficked and quite far away from my family to like the other end of the country. And, a lot of stuff happened there. And then when I was 20, I got out. So I started when I was 16. I got out when I was 20. Um, and then I moved to Ireland, where I lived for 8 years with my ex-partner, the father of my children. But unfortunately, that relationship deteriorated quite badly as well. So I then lived in a women's refuge during the pandemic, which is the worst time
Oh, wow.
to live anywhere. So I spent the first lockdown living in a shelter, but it's been uphill since then.
Right on.
That was my last major traumatic event. But since then, it's been uphill and I'm fine and everything is good. It's been quite the journey. Like I said, the last few years have been rewarding enough for me to say, okay, I'm now at a place where I can talk about these things or
Yeah.
maybe work with other people to help.
So can I back you up all the way back to when you were a child and your mom and dad? I mean, your mom's not, she was from Austria. Is that what you
Austria,
said?
yeah.
Austria. How did she get out there and how did she meet your dad and how did that all go down?
So it was my family on the Austrian side is quite adventurous. So they're quite wild. But my mom was kind of she was a drug addict. She was essentially running away from having to go live in a house and have a job. So she came to India essentially trying to get score cheap drugs as you do in the late 80s and 90s just to kind of get away from society. And she was very much a hippie. Not that I have anything like not to say that hippies are drug addicts, but she was
Yeah.
a drug addict and a hippie. So that's essentially what she was looking for. She was kind of looking for her little Shangri-La where she doesn't have to have responsibilities and kind of just can sit on a mountain and do drugs. And that's how she met my dad. She essentially just climbed up a mountain because she heard that they had good weed up there. Um, and ended up in this secluded little hut above a waterfall that had no electricity, no heating, no nothing. And they just kind of sang and danced around the fire. And then 9 months later, I was there. So it sounds quite magical and quite whimsical when I say it now, but the
Yeah.
reality of it was quite horrendous. My parents should not have been parents. They definitely should not have had me. I'm really glad they did, but
Yeah.
the circumstances of my birth and my upbringing were quite horrendous and really, really bad. And they were really bad people. So, yeah, had she been a more better person or maybe less in the falling into her drug addiction, it might have been a really nice upbringing in a really wonderful world. Sadly, that was not the case.
She
So, yeah.
she escaped or left and went back to Austria and brought you along with her. What was
Yeah.
that journey like for you?
I do. Like we went back and forth quite a lot, even during my earlier childhood. It wasn't pleasant at all. We were kind of back and forth between Austria and India, and she didn't really tell me when it was going to happen. Sometimes she just woke me up at 2 o'clock in the morning and ripped me out of bed and dragged me, the whatever 1,000 or so miles down
Wow.
to Delhi,
Were you guys flying or
onto the
driving,
plane.
or how were you getting there?
Um, so however we got there, like on the back of a bus, on the roof of a bus, on the roof of a train. India in the 90s wasn't exactly a fully developed country with nice freeways or anything. It was very kind of rural. You had to just get there however you managed to get there. It was not pleasant even at those. And then we finally left. We finally left for good. She didn't tell me that we were leaving for good. Like, I had friends, I went to school in India and everything. And she just said, well, we're going for a holiday. And then in Austria, she told me, yeah, actually, we're staying,
Oh, wow. So were you
which
living with your
a very nice
father
thing.
and mother at the same time, or had they separated?
And my dad didn't come with us at that time. He came to visit a few times after, but he never really stayed in Austria. It just didn't work for them.
Yeah.
They divorced when I was 11, which was good. Like, they should not have been. They should just not have been together. It was just,
Yeah.
they were not capable
There's a lot of
of anything
relationships
healthy,
like
really.
that.
I don't think.
I don't know why it takes a lot of people a lot of years to separate sometimes,
Yeah,
but that's good that they separated. And so you guys
yeah.
stayed in Austria, and
It's
11 to 20, what was life like?
So it was fine. It was fine for a lot of the time until when I was 16. It started going downhill quite a lot. I went to school. I was quite happy with school. I went to school even while I was working as a prostitute. I finished school. I managed to graduate with quite good grades. I managed to get into law school,
Wow.
and I worked as a prostitute. I worked in a brothel while I was in law school. The contrast between both sides of my world was such a
Yeah.
stark contrast that it took me a while, yeah, to reconcile the two parts of my life into one person was quite difficult. And I still struggle with that sometimes, where I'm like, oh, but I'm a screenwriter, but also I'm an ex-prostitute, and I'm a mom, but also, I hung around with Hell's Angels when I was a kid. So it's it's really difficult to
Can I ask,
bridge
like,
that.
how did you, I mean, one doesn't just walk into a brothel and say, give me a job, or how were you exposed to that? Or maybe you do walk into a brothel and say, give me a job. I don't know.
Um, so I have to go a little bit further, back. I firmly place the blame, if there is any, for what happened to me at my mother's feet. Like, my mother is 100% responsible for creating the type of person who would just walk into a brothel and say, give me a job. My mother, oh, by the way, like, let's put all the trigger warnings onto the start of the show. My mother sexually abused me severely when I was a child, as did my father, but my mother was definitely the perpetrator of most of the abuse. And so she created within me this kind of idea that uh, I didn't really exist other than to please people. And my purpose in life was to be used for sexual pleasure and sexual gratification of others. That was an idea that was deeply embedded within me from like earliest childhood onwards. So when I was 15, when I was 16, when I was kind of 14, the idea that I should sleep around, that wasn't even like, that was, of course, I would, because that's all I'm good for. So when you experience sexual abuse as a child, so early on in childhood, that idea that you are not worth anything other than to be used for sexual gratification, that's such a deeply embedded kind of understanding of who you are as a human being. So when I kind of grew up and my parents stopped abusing me when I was probably around 7, 8, when I kind of became a teenager and started going out with boys and stuff, it was a given for me that that would be a huge part of the interaction I had with other people. So when I was 16, by that time I had already been with so many boys, and like it didn't really come out of the blue. And when I met the man who then brought me into prostitution, my pimp, for lack of a better word, he, oh, it was easy pickings for him. It was so easy for him. Like, I literally walked up to him one day and said, I know you own a brothel. What's it going to take for me to get working? So yes, actually, yeah, I did just walk up to a pimp and say, I may as well make some money off of this because that's all I'm good for anyway, because that had been so deeply kind of embedded into my understanding of what I was good for, which is horrendous, which is a really, really bad thing to happen to a human being, because I didn't really understand myself as a human being. I didn't think of myself as worthy of anything, not love, not affection, not care, not attention, certainly, because my parents had not created that understanding within me. So yes, let's blame the man who actually physically drove me to the brothel. Absolutely. Let's place blame at his feet. The actual people that are to blame
Were your
are
parents?
100%
Yeah.
my parents. Yeah.
Can I ask, do you know why they stopped abusing you at 7 years old? Was it because you were old enough to know
I
better?
I yeah, that was literally it. I had conversations with my mother later on in life. I haven't spoken to my mother in 10 years,
Yeah.
for obvious reasons, and I
Yes.
will never speak to her again. When these really traumatic, and you know this from your own work and kind of from your own background, PTSD or traumatic events often make us forget these things. We don't remember all the things that happened to us because we cannot remember the things that happened to us. Our brain is designed to protect us. So those memories were very, very buried and very well hidden from myself for most of my life until I started therapy and I started seeing patterns in my own behavior and tried to understand them. And then I started remembering, and then I started realizing, oh, that's what that was. It wasn't actually just, how other parents would treat their children. Not everybody goes through this. This is what that was, right? So you start recognizing them much later. So I started kind of remembering things. I started recognizing things. And I asked my mother about certain situations. And she would laugh it off and say, oh, you don't remember, you don't remember, you don't remember, which kind of makes me think that she stopped because I was becoming more conscious of what was actually happening to my body. There was a risk of me talking about it. And so and also because when we moved to Austria, there's institutions,
Yeah.
there's police, there's the equivalent of child protective services. So, these things are not possible really. And also, she was doing fewer drugs. I don't think she ever stopped doing drugs completely. I'm not sure. I don't know which particular drug she was on. Definitely weed, but
Yeah.
again, being a drug addict does not make you a sexual abuser. I just really
Yeah.
want to make that very
Absolutely.
smoking a bit of weed, not
Yeah.
turning you into a predator. Like, no, of course not. But yeah. So I don't have the chemical details of what she consumed.
Do you think there was any kind of warning signs of people around you? Did the people around you have any idea? Were they good people or were they just all a bunch of druggy hippies?
Most of them, like my family would have been like really wonderful. Like my cousins and my aunties on my Indian side were really wonderful. My Austrian family was very cold and uncaring about everything, really. So they didn't really, if they saw something, they wouldn't have cared. I don't know if anybody saw anything. I have memories of my auntie looking after me and trying to make me hurt less. So that's a very early memory I have of her holding me and trying to comfort me. So there would have been people who knew that my parents weren't good parents. I don't think anybody knew the extent of the exact things that went on. They just knew that they fought a lot and they presumed that I was getting caught up in the fights. I don't think anybody suspected the extent of the actual sexual violence that took place.
Kind
And
of
even if they had known, I don't think they could have done anything.
yeah. I just kind of want to
Yeah.
understand where you're
I mean, we
coming
can.
from.
Like, these are important things to talk about.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
there's a lot of
Yeah.
people out there who have been abused, and so many people don't talk about it. And
Mhm.
I know people who hadn't talked about it and now they do, and they're actually getting some relief from it. Share these stories and other people hear them and they
Yeah.
feel comfortable sharing them as well. And so that's kind of why I wanted to dive into this.
Yeah.
So you got out of the brothel. Like, how did that
Yeah.
happen?
So that was a really kind of, I always say these things grow in the tiniest little increments. And most of the time, our healing journey consists of the tiniest little steps that we could possibly take to heal. So I'd say it took me about a year before I even realized that I wanted to dig it out. So I had been brought to Innsbruck. So I was living in Upper Austria, which is kind of like the central Austrian kind of heartland, let's say, and then very close to the German border. And then I was brought to Innsbruck, which is a city in the mountains and very kind of wealthy. And I was locked in a room for a year and a half there. Ironically, I mean, I was locked in, I say, but I owned the key to my own lock, so I could have left. I just couldn't leave psychologically. And that's also something I often talk about because when we are in a situation, whether it's domestic abuse, whether it's, we're living with an abuser or we're living in a situation that we feel like we can't get out of, we really can't get out of it. Even though physically you could leave, psychologically you cannot. There is something preventing you on the inside from leaving, which I'm sure you recognize this. Many people recognize this is what it is. It's an internal kind of lock that you have to unlock before you can unlock the actual physical door. So I was locked in this room for a long time. I was working as a prostitute. I had quite severe violence happened and took place. I had my jaw broken. I had horrendous things. So it took me about a year in that place to then kind of start thinking, actually, I don't really want this. I don't really want to be here. Should I be here? Like, is this really what I should be doing? So I would wake up one morning and think, oh, maybe one day I could write something that could get published. I would really like to be a writer. And then I would spend the rest of the day hating myself for being so full of myself as to think that there was any chance that I could ever do something like that. But then I'd wake up the next morning and that intrusive little thought of like, yeah, but maybe I could, that would creep in again. And then maybe I'd only spent 3 hours telling myself that I was the worst human being ever for having such horrendous thoughts of freedom. So, I might spend 10 seconds a day feeling like there might be more. And then the next day it was 20 seconds. And the next day it was a minute. And then the next day it was an hour of me dreaming about a possibility that was out there for me. And then all of a sudden I had this strength to kind of say, do you know what? No. I've spent all day yesterday thinking about what it could be like if I got out. I'm just going to go. I'm just going to go get out. I'm just going to go. But it takes such a long time. And the steps are so small that you almost don't notice them as they're happening.
So are you living
So
in this place?
it finally, yeah, I was living in the same room that I was working in essentially.
Wow.
So I had to sleep in the same bed that I was, working in. So I always slept with my pillow at the foot end so that I wasn't in the exact same position that I was in during my working day, if you know what I mean. It was horrendous. Like it was, I mean, you can't make it up. It was just absolutely horrendous. And yeah, it was bad. But yeah, it kind of rock bottom, I think,
So what's
is the
that
thing
day
that I
like
always
when
say.
you
I hit rock bottom.
what's that day like when you say enough is enough, you grab your stuff, you walk out the door for the last
I
time?
stood up. Yeah, I stood up. I woke up quite early. I was drinking a lot at the time. I was drinking quite heavily. I never did drugs because I kind of knew that that wasn't something I wanted to get into, but I was drinking quite heavily. So I woke up in the morning and I poured myself a cup of tea and poured some whiskey in my tea. And I stood up on the bed. Like I remember it distinctly. I was standing in the middle of the bed drinking this infused tea. And I just thought, I'm not stupid. I got half of a law degree. I had to quit law school when they brought me away to this room, but I got into law school with quite good grades. I'm not stupid. I'm not a stupid person. Why shouldn't I be able to get a normal job? It had been so kind of embedded into me that a normal job was not possible for me because not only am I completely useless, not only am I completely stupid, but also I'm a prostitute. And I can never, ever, ever, ever escape that kind of huge big black stain that's tattooed onto my forehead that everybody who ever looks at me is never going to see a woman or a human being. All they're ever going to see is a prostitute, and everybody's going to hate me for that. I had this internalized sense of shame. And then I just thought, no, no, I can get a job. It is possible for me to get a quote unquote normal job. I walked out the door, got myself a little call center job, and got myself a little apartment. Got myself my second job. My second job out of prostitution was at Amnesty International.
Oh, wow.
So I got myself quite a good job. And then I worked for Microsoft as soon as I came to Ireland. Turns out I wasn't actually stupid. Turns out
Pretty
people
smart.
would immediately point their fingers at me and cry, shame, shame. And that realization kind of hit so suddenly that I walked into the office in the call center job and got that job. I was hired on the spot. And like,
what is
that
that
didn't
first
seem
couple
possible.
of weeks like? I mean, you're walking around and you're free, basically. I mean, it must have been kind of magical for you.
Yeah, it was magical, but it was also very, very hard because obviously my pimp wasn't really very happy to just let an asset walk out the door. So I had to deal with a lot. Like I had to deal with threats, midnight visits, threats to my family, pleading, violence, never a peaceful moment. He showed up at my workplace trying to get me fired, showed up at my landlord's trying to get me kicked out of my new apartment.
Is prostitution illegal? And can you go to the police?
Yeah.
I lost.
So prostitution is legal in Austria. So if you're working in a brothel, you're paying your taxes, you know, you get checked out medically. But the way I was doing it, which is out of like an illegal apartment, was not legal. So I did not have the protection of the law. I had no protection whatsoever. Nobody even knew that I was in the city. So had something really bad happen to me, nobody would even know where I was. In a brothel, you have a security guard at the door. So if somebody acts up, you're protected right away. There's other women there. If you're by yourself in an apartment and nobody knows that you're even there, there's no incentive for the person coming in not to act up and not to be violent. So that made it all the worse. So yeah, the first few weeks after I left were quite difficult. He calmed down after a while and he went on his own kind of healing journey thereafter and kind of healed himself and got better and is now living very happily. So I'm glad for him. He got out too eventually. So that's a good thing in my book, you know, because he must have been a damaged person. No person who's okay would be capable or willing to do that to another human being. He also needed healing. I'm glad he's healed. But yeah, it was difficult. But I always say that the worst things that could be done to a human being had already been done to me at that point. Once you're not afraid of death anymore, once you've faced the very clear possibility that you're going to die within the next few minutes at the hands of a rapist, finding an apartment doesn't seem like such a big challenge anymore.
Yeah.
But also, ironically, it did seem like an impossible challenge because you think you're not capable of like the normal life, mundane things. So you have to relearn all those things, like the small things. You have to relearn how to not look over your shoulder when you're grocery shopping. Or, you know, that it's okay that you are out grocery shopping. And that was a really interesting lesson for me. It was like, oh, I'm allowed to walk through the store and it's fine. I don't have to rush home. It's all of this is fine. So yeah, those were interesting lessons in those first few weeks.
And we have a little bit of a delay, so I don't want to jump over the, top of you. But so I just interviewed a guy, and he dealt with forgiveness. His dad murdered his mom, and so that's a pretty extreme thing. But part of your healing journey, you said that your pimp got out of this lifestyle. As part of your healing, did you forgive him, or you just wash your hands of it and move on?
I have completely forgiven him.
Yeah.
I've forgiven everybody. There's not a single person that I hate. There's not a single person that I blame. I blame my parents for making me to the person. But I don't hate my parents.
Oh.
I will never speak to them again for the rest of my life. But I want them to find healing too. I don't think my mother can. I don't think she could heal. I don't know what's wrong with her, but there's something fundamentally wrong with her. So finding healing from that is probably going to be very difficult for her.
Yeah.
I don't want them to be unhappy. I don't want them to die.
Forgive, but don't forget. And you don't have to have toxic people in your life by any means. Wash your hands and move on with your life and wish them well. A lot of people find healing that way. So, so you got this job with Microsoft. That's a pretty dope job.
Yeah.
That's cool. And then you get a Amnesty International. What's that like?
It was very brief. I only worked there for about 6 months. It was nice. I worked in like door-to-door fundraising, which was that was really fun. But then I worked in like the office part. So I just essentially just paperwork and like, filing. It was fun. But then I moved to Ireland very quickly after that. So I moved to Ireland. I met my ex while I was living in Innsbruck. I didn't meet him through prostitution. I met him after I left. Well, yeah, that would have been Pretty Woman, and that's not realistic. That's not how that happens at all. So I met him after, and I very quickly decided that I was going to move to Ireland to be with him more. And the first few years were really good. Like we had our children, it was nice. But yeah, I think the misunderstanding or like my self kind of hatred and my understanding of myself as this like useless person. As soon as that kind of fell away from me, this guy was the limit. I worked with Microsoft. I was very happy there. I spent my 20s kind of in the corporate world and then moved away from the corporate world, obviously, to come into film and to come into writing. And now I work as a writer, as a screenwriter. So as soon as you kind of start realizing just how capable you actually are, the next step and the next step and the next step, they always become easier because you're like, I've done this. I've come this far. So I can't do this. And that kind of fearlessness, once you've overcome the worst of your fear and have really kind of come onto a really healing kind of path, the rest becomes really easy. Like it's not difficult anymore at that point.
What kind of things do you do? I mean, you're obviously in such a better place. What kind of healing modalities did you go to counseling or you just healed yourself or you working with other people? Like, how does somebody go from one extreme to the other successfully?
Definitely therapy. I mean, without professional help, you can do it. It's possible, but I just found with as many issues as I had to deal with, as many kind of hundreds of layers of different levels of trauma, I just felt like a professional approach was probably the way to go for me. 2020 or 2021, those 2 years aren't they?
We're wonderful and terrible all in the same. It's like, oh, we're home. This is nice,
Yeah,
but
whatever.
yeah.
One of the pandemic, I started therapy and I've been in therapy ever since. And my therapist is amazing and she kicks ass and she kicks my ass and she's amazing. But yeah, so a professional approach was definitely important. But then also kind of this introspection of like understanding all the things that were done and really kind of taking an interest in how physically, just like from a very physical standpoint, how my brain, my actual gray matter inside here is developed differently because of what happened. So I am physically, my brain is physically not the brain that it was supposed to be. First of all, because my mother was a drug addict while I was developing in the womb. That was the first kind of hurdle. All the connections and the synapses and everything that was formed during my early childhood were formed differently. So with complex PTSD, if you're exposed to these really traumatic events for a prolonged period of time, your brain develops different. So just really understanding the actual medical, physical nature of my condition and what had been done was really important. And that was really, really helpful. And asking questions of like, okay, but how do I unlearn patterns that brought me into difficult situations? How do I unlearn the things that made me go for abusive relationships or abusive partners or made me not go for the positive things? So I think having a scientific almost approach and seeing my psychological issues as medical issues,
Hmm.
as mental health issues,
Yep.
rather than as, oh, I'm just a little bit crazy. That was really helpful to just kind of really dissect what could be done. And then layered on top of that, art. I think writing is such a tremendous tool to use, and that it was really helpful to just kind of through art express myself and understand what had happened. All of those things, I don't think any single thing could have helped me. It had to be like a combination, like a wholesale kind of combination of all of those different ingredients that brought me to a better place.
Well, that's amazing that you've recognized that and you're taking all these steps to improve your life. And I mean, you've had a pretty incredible life. Aside from therapy, you're also an author, screenwriter, poet. You have a film festival. You want to talk about that at all?
Yeah. I do. So my film festival came out of kind of I lived in Wicklow at the time, which is like the Hollywood of Ireland. And literally Hollywood goes there all the time. They made a Disney movie there, and Cocaine Bear was shot there, and all sorts of different big films come to Wicklow. But it was never really stories from the place itself that were being told. It was always like big Hollywood stories. So we figured we want to create an avenue for local filmmakers to really have a place where they can showcase their local stories from Wicklow about Wicklow. We developed this little short film festival. It's been going for 3 years. We're so proud of it. We're delighted every year to welcome. You get your little red carpet moment and you
Yeah.
get your little awards. It's a very localized thing. You can't enter the festival unless you shot your film in the county.
Right.
It's a really local thing, which I'm very proud of and really happy about.
That's
It's great.
incredible. So, I mean, you have a website and you have all kinds of different stuff on there.
Yeah, everything that anybody needs to know about me is on my website. I often do outreach, so if anybody needs to get in touch about any of the topics and they feel like they don't have anybody to talk about, that's also something I do. The contact details for that are also on my website.
Right on. Well, man, you're taking a deep dive, a hard dive with me today. I appreciate you like going through it, like you have an incredible story. Any words of advice for somebody kind of in your situation or your previous situation?
Yeah. My only words of advice would be to take it slow and to forgive yourself for how long it takes, because it might take you years, but it's okay that it does. And that's what I always say is like, it's okay that it takes time
Yeah,
and that patience is a good thing.
man. You have a incredible story. You have a great heart, and I'm so proud of you for like getting out of that situation and uh being the best version of yourself and not being held by the things that happen to you because those aren't who you are. That's just stuff that happened to you. And that's how I'm trying to live my life. So I appreciate you.
Thank you so much for having me on. It was such a pleasure talking to you. Thank
You as
you.
well. Thank you.